Hey everyone, it's Jake Wynn, and welcome back to Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly. Before we jump into this episode, I just want to say how much fun I've been having putting these episodes together. Getting to share these stories, record these conversations, and connect with all of you who care about history. It's honestly been one of the most rewarding projects I've gotten to work on in the last few years. If you haven't already, make sure you follow or subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. It's the best way to keep up with the new episodes as soon as we release them. And it really helps us to grow this community of people who love learning about the past. All right, today we're heading to a small town in northeastern Pennsylvania called Waverly. It's a place that might seem quiet on the surface, but when you dig into its history, you find some incredible stories about the fight against slavery in the years before the Civil War. I'm talking with E.J. Murphy, a public historian and one member of the team behind the Destination Freedom Project at Waverly Community House. E.J. and I have been working together since 2019, when we worked together as part of the Penn Civil War Project. Since then, he's become one of the most thoughtful researchers and storytellers I know when it comes to the Civil War's political and social impact in northeastern Pennsylvania. In this conversation, we talk about Waverly's place in the abolitionist movement, how the politics of slavery reached even the smallest towns in the North, and how EJ is sharing those stories today. Let's get into it. Here's my conversation with EJ Murphy of the Destination Freedom Project. All right, well, we have EJ Murphy here from Destination Freedom. We are super excited to have you on the Public History Podcast. EJ, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jay. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I know we've been kind of talking about doing this for a long time, and I'm glad we were able to finally nail down time to do it. This is great.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here, and I'm glad that we finally found a time to make this work. So excited for you to be here. I want to dive right into where you are right now physically and the work that you do with a program called Destination Freedom in northeastern Pennsylvania. So for our listeners out there who may not be familiar with the story of Waverly with Destination Freedom, let listeners know kind of what your program is and a little bit of the history as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now I'm at the Waverly Community House. The Waverly Community House is a nonprofit. It is a community organization. We've been around for 105 years, and ever since the inception of the Waverly Community House into the local community, it's always been a public-facing building. It's been historically known for kids programs. It started out with a lot of kids programs. They hosted the Boy Scouts, which was a huge thing here for a long time. And then over time, it just kind of progressed, and we offer all sorts of different things. To this day, we still do have kids programs like a preschool and after school. I actually started here a long time ago when I was teaching social studies. In the summers, I would run the summer camp here. And that's kind of how I got started. And that's what that's the foundations of our organization. But the newest of our programs that's very much public facing is the Destination Freedom Program. And that is a program that is centered around our small town's role in the Underground Railroad. And we really get into not just the history of Waverly specifically. We do talk about kind of northeastern Pennsylvania as a whole, but it's like I said, one of kind of the newest programs that we have. And luckily, it's been pretty successful since I got started, and had a lot of progress. The program's really grown over the time that I've been working here, and it's just really fascinating to see how people respond to this story that we tell here.
So for our listeners that may not be as familiar as you and I with the geography of northeastern Pennsylvania, can you kind of place Waverly on the map? Where is it located? What's it close to?
So Waverly is in what is now Lackawanna County. During the historical time period that we talk about, Lackawanna County did not yet exist. So we're kind of in like in the middle of what I would call like kind of the central hub of the Underground Railroad in northeastern Pennsylvania. We're just a couple miles north of Scranton. So if you're familiar with Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, Scranton is right in Lackawanna County, biggest city in Lackawanna County. We're just to the north of that, and we are just to the south of towns that we talk about in our town, like Montrose. Montrose, Pennsylvania is just to the north of us. We're about For those of us who might be listening from maybe New York, we're about 45 minutes from Binghamton. So we're not too far from the New York border. So we're really in that northern tier of northeastern Pennsylvania.
What's the reason that Waverly comes into existence? So what's the original reason that people are settling there? Why does the town get started?
So it's very interesting how Waverly kind of transformed over time. It started as a small farming village. It wasn't too far from one of the railroads that was getting constructed in the area, and it was a very very small community. People started settling in this area in the 1815s to kind of like the 1820s and early 1830s time period. And again, it was a small farming village. Eventually, it kind of transforms over time, and as places in the post-Civil War period, places like Scranton and Binghamton, which I just mentioned, as they're kind of becoming larger industrial cities, the people of Waverly are kind of flocking elsewhere, but then the local industrialists start to see Waverly and places just outside of the city as good kind of like summer vacation destinations. And if you drive around Waverly today, you're going to see it's a pretty affluent area. A lot of mansions, things like that. Some of the surviving mansions of the early industrialists of northeastern Pennsylvania, like I said, particularly Scranton. Our building, the Waverly Community House, was actually built in memory of Henry Beeland Jr. He brought the DuPont company to northeastern Pennsylvania in the post-war years. And he actually got started with DuPont during the Civil War. But what happens is him and his family, they get involved in all sorts of business. Again, if you're familiar with the Scranton area especially, you might have heard of this the Scranton Lace Company. His family was heavily involved in that. He gets involved in banking and stuff. But the Beeland family is one of the families that ends up having a summer home here. And they ended up falling in love with the area. When Henry Beeland Jr. passed away, his wife wanted to build a living memorial to him. And that's what our building exists. That's the reason our building exists. And that's why it's always been a community center, because it's kind of been in the Beeland family's, their want for the area and for the building was it for it to be a community building. So that's why this building exists. And that's kind of how Waverly, like I said, transformed over, the kind of antebellum period to, the late 1800s, early 1900s.
I want to hone in a little bit more on time period. I know that you're focused on, and that we have talked a lot about and collaborated a lot on projects like Pennsylvania and the Civil War as well, looking at the Civil War time period.
Yep.
And you mentioned that, the Underground Railroad is a big part of your story there in Waverly. Can you talk a little bit about why Waverly? Why is that such an important part of the community story there?
Yeah, it's Waverly. One of the things, even to this day, Waverly, the residents of Waverly, the local area, they're very proud of the history here. Not just the Underground Railroad in that time period, really all of Waverly's history, but this history really strikes a chord with people, I think, because of the sense of community. It was, a fascinating time period where you see normal, average, everyday people who are living in this small farming village. You see them kind of coming together. Even in the face of a lot of adversity in the area, coming together to do something that they thought was important and right. And the reason that Waverly kind of becomes one of the important Underground Railroad hubs in the area is because it's kind of centrally located to other really important towns. But because you have these different towns that are connected and people in these towns that know each other and know who's kind of sympathetic to the Underground Railroad movement and the anti-slavery and abolitionist movements, Waverly, like I said, was this important jump-off point, particularly from Wilkes-Barre. Wilkes-Barre had a man named William Gildersleeve. When it comes to the abolitionists of the area, the white abolitionists, he was probably the most active and the most influential in the Underground Railroad. And he had connections here in Waverly, which would then connect to Montrose. And Montrose, again, like I said, kind of I would say Waverly's like just a small version of the same story of all these different towns kind of connecting. And because Waverly happens to be right in the middle of them, that's kind of how we kind of landed on the Underground Railroad map.
So what are some of the politics, what are some of the feelings? Is this like a really strongly abolitionist community? I would imagine that it would have an element of that if there's some safety to having it being on the Underground Railroad. That there's some positive sentiments towards the abolitionist movement. Is that the case in Waverly?
Yeah, like I said, the one thing that we really try to do in our program, and we're giving, so our program started as a self-guided walking tour. We have a map that people would come and pick up and just kind of go walk around. But then we had a lot of people who started. This is one of the reasons we kind of knew we had something with this program, which was started in 2017 by our current executive director, Gia Tujin. She was integral in getting this program off the ground. She's really the one who kind of started the whole thing. And when we started to see that people were really curious in his story, at the time I was teaching social studies in Scranton, and my curriculum aligned directly with what our program covers. I literally taught from basically the Revolutionary period through Reconstruction. And when we started getting calls and started to see that people wanted to kind of hear more, that's when I started getting involved, helping out with some of the information, giving tours, things like that. And I think when people come and take our tour, because we get into the politics of it, and we talk about how even though this town was a part of the Underground Railroad, did have an abolitionist movement, had a pretty sizable, for again it being a small farming village, a pretty sizable number of abolitionists. But like I said, they had resistance here, and that's something that I think people are surprised about, particularly when we get into the voting results during the Civil War. I do mention, we talk about the presidential election of 1860 and 1864, which Luzerne County specifically back then was a pretty difficult area for Lincoln and the Republican Party. So politically, it was divided. I believe in 1860, Waverly itself, in terms of its voting population, I believe they voted like 35 to 32 in favor of Lincoln in 1860, and then in 1864 they vote 29 to 28 against him. So. So even though you did have this abolitionist movement and it was part of the Underground Railroad, you definitely had a population of people who were probably not so thrilled about that going on. I haven't seen much in terms of how active that kind of pushback and resistance was. So I don't know if people actually clashed in town because of it. There's not a lot of surviving letters and diaries from people who lived in Waverly at the time. So it's it's one of those kind of pieces of the story that's hard to put together. But it was definitely more divided than I think people tend to think about when they come to take our tour and they are expecting to hear this story about this little Underground Railroad abolitionist hub.
So I know you talked a little bit about the sources, the lack of sources that you're working with here. I'm curious about the sources that you do have. What are the sources you're relying upon to tell these stories in Waverly and in the surrounding communities?
So a lot of things, especially related to the Underground Railroad, it kind of started with there was a book published in the 1950s called "This Is Waverly." It's a typical local history. It's not, if you're an academic, it's probably not, your favorite type of book to use as a reference. But it was a good starting point because it gives you names that you can kind of start, following the breadcrumbs and kind of picking up pieces of the story here and there. The central figure, or one of the central figures to our story, was a man named George Keyes, who I can't remember if I remember seeing you. Did you write about George Keyes at any point?
I don't think I have.
No? Okay. Well, yeah, maybe I thought you did. But anyway, George Keyes was formerly enslaved in Maryland, and he's the first formerly enslaved person to make his way to Waverly and actually settle here and put roots down. And that was one of the names that was kind of mentioned a lot in this local history. And that really kind of puts you down the path of, okay, how do I find some primary sources that might be able to back some of this stuff up? They have newspaper accounts of George Keyes, his son, George Jr., the post-war years, and both of these individuals actually fought in the 22nd USCT during the war. His son, George Jr., is going to make his way to Scranton and in the post-war years, and he's going to be a very visible member of Scranton's community, not just Scranton's Black community, but the overall community. And they do a lot of profiles of him during his time, and they talk. That's where you get a lot of the detail about his family story. But besides connecting the local histories and kind of the oral histories that you hear, you also there was a book recently published, I believe it was 2017, right around when we started the program, called Embattled Freedom by Jim Remsen. He was a former Philadelphia Inquirer reporter who was from Waverly, and when he retired, he wrote a book about kind of this story as well. And that was a great source. His was more academic leaning, obviously, than the 1950s local history. Those were pretty good secondary sources. And then you do have in local historical societies, things like that, you do have some letters that you can kind of start connecting pieces to. One of the most fascinating that I've come across was a letter written by a Waverly abolitionist to Montrose's judge, William Jessup, who was a very important figure in the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement in northeastern Pennsylvania, but was also very influential politically. He was actually the chairman of the committee that wrote the 1860 Republican Party platform. So this letter is written in response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And it's the Waverly abolitionist is asking Judge Jessup for active, organized political resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act. And in this letter, he not only describes the local black residents going to their work with, I think the exact quote was, with their pockets loaded with pistols. And so it gives you a sense that there was still that danger of potentially being caught and brought back into bondage. But in the letter, he also lists names of local residents who are part of the abolitionist movement and who could be, he kind of describes it as people who can kind of be trusted with being a part of this organized resistance. And that is probably the best actual primary source we have in terms of giving us names and giving us an idea of what it was like in Waverly. And then from there, like I said, you got newspaper articles, things like that, that help you kind of put the pieces together. So it's always interesting to have to tell people, especially people who are from around here, because when people show up and they take our tour, a lot of people at least, they do the whole thing where, what about this house that's right down the road? And what about this guy that I heard whose family might still be around? And I heard that they were part of, this movement too. And a lot of times you just kind of have to say, well, maybe, it could be, it could have been, because there really just isn't a lot to really hone down and nail down the facts. So we have a couple names, a couple stories that, again, like I said, really give us the backbone and the foundation of this history. But it's all those secondary and primary sources that really help you put the whole story together.
I'm curious too about the kind of demographics of the community there. So you mentioned that you have an formerly enslaved man who escapes and comes to Waverly. What's the demographic makeup? Is there when there becomes a black community in Waverly, is that as a result of the Underground Railroad, or how does that community come into existence?
So yeah, the Underground Railroad definitely played a role in Waverly's growing black community. I believe we've been kind of able to nail down that at one time the population of the black community in Waverly at its peak was probably about 75 people or so. Which again, this is at this point in time is a small farming village, so that's a pretty sizable population, and it's a mix of not just former slaves and their families, but it's also, you have over time local freeborn African Americans are going to come to Waverly because of this growing black community. So it really, over time, it becomes very sizable. And the same thing happens in, like I said, those other towns that connect, to Waverly, like Wilkes-Barre and Montrose, places even farther out like Towanda, Pennsylvania, where David Wilmot is, kind of famously from. And it's funny, I actually recently came across an article from a Carbondale newspaper in Carbondale, nearby town. And the paper, this is from the 1880s, I believe, and the paper actually talked about the fact that in towns like Waverly, Montrose, and Wilkes-Barre, there were there were a lot of black voters in these towns, and they were highlighting this as being a result of the Underground Railroad, which I thought was pretty fascinating. So yeah, it's a mixed mash of the fact that it was the Underground Railroad. You have a formerly enslaved population, you have their families, but then you also have, like I said, people who are kind of flocking to these areas because of these growing communities.
So these routes on the Underground Railroad, so I'm thinking of some of these maps I've seen of different kind of routes of people. It tend to be, whether it's along the Mississippi or, through Appalachia. What I know, and this can vary from individual to individual or group to group as they're working their way towards freedom out of the South. Generally, what is the route that is bringing people through Waverly, as enslaved people are seeking their freedom and heading north?
So the Susquehanna River definitely plays a part in that, especially when it comes to people navigating kind of to Wilkes-Barre first. It's because Wilkes-Barre is right on the Susquehanna River. And there were some important events related to the Underground Railroad that happened right along the banks of the Susquehanna, right there. Waverly is a little bit. It's not right on the Susquehanna. What ends up happening with Waverly is that it kind of connects to Wilkes-Barre through some of the Native American paths that are created here early on, and that's kind of what leads people to Waverly. And like I said, it's kind of off the Susquehanna. It's not quite as close as towns like Wilkes-Barre are. Towanda is, again, it's another Underground Railroad town nearby that's right on the Susquehanna River. So that played a part, but it was actually Native American history that really kind of shaped Waverly's role in the whole thing, because some of the main Native American paths went right through town. Abington Road, which is kind of the main road in Waverly right now, that was famously one of the more widely used Native American paths. That's a fascinating story to be able to kind of bring into the picture, because that's something that, again, people kind of remove and put these different eras of history kind of in these boxes, and it's interesting to see them all kind of connect over time and see how the public kind of reacts to that.
So as people are seeking their freedom, I know some of them, it sounds like, settle in Waverly. Are most of them continuing north into New York and then up to Canada? Is that, how does that change over time?
Yeah, that's definitely the goal for most people. Again, Waverly I gave you that number 75 at one time. The overall number of formerly enslaved people who made their way to Waverly is much larger than that. But most people were looking to move farther north. As you mentioned, Canada was usually the goal. But you had, again, some nearby towns that were a little bit farther north, a little bit more secluded. You have, like I said, Binghamton, Elmira, New York, which is just over the border. And then there are some other towns, again, right along that southern tier of New York that also played a role. But over time, I think what ends up happening is because of, I mentioned George Keyes before, the first former slave to actually settle in Waverly. It's because of some of the anchors of those communities, like George Keyes, because they lay a foundation for the communities that are going to start to build. People tend to feel more comfortable staying, especially as they realize that there's employment opportunity in a lot of these different towns. And that's kind of how you start to see the buildup of people saying, you know what, I don't think I'm going to continue on. I think, right here is a place where I can make a life. And I think that's kind of how things developed in Waverly, was just kind of over time, slowly, people realizing that it was a place that, like I said, you could make a living and be safe.
And you mentioned this earlier too about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I'm curious about that, and some of I know that there are stories in the vicinity of Waverly related to people coming in, bounty hunters, etc., seeking these formerly enslaved people who have settled in northeastern Pennsylvania or are transiting through the region. How did that impact Waverly and the surrounding region?
Yeah, I think it's the Fugitive Slave Act that really solidified the abolitionist and anti-slavery movement in the area. It wasn't just that, the law mandated that Northerners had to actively participate in the apprehension of former slaves, but I think it brought, for a lot of the local residents, I think it brought the violence that came along with the system. I think it brought that to their front door for the first time. The most famous example of conflict because of the fugitive slave law and slave catchers coming to town was in 1853 in Wilkes-Barre, and it got national news. There are a couple different stories that get national attention in newspapers throughout the country, stemming from northeastern Pennsylvania. But this 1853 incident becomes the most well-known because of the violence associated with it. The story was that there's a man named William Thomas. He was a formerly enslaved resident of Wilkes-Barre, and he was working at the Phoenix Hotel, which was, again, kind of right along the banks of the Susquehanna River. And as he's working as a server in the hotel, there are two gentlemen who are dining, and they are, kind of acting as patrons of the hotel. And while they're dining, they attempt to kidnap him and try to handcuff him and bring him back. This man, William Thomas, fights back, and it becomes a riot. It spills outside, and Thomas actually jumps into the Susquehanna River to try to get away. And as he's doing so, these two deputies who are trying to apprehend him and bring him back down south they start shooting at him. And that's what kind of sparked the indignation of the local residents, because there was a huge crowd that gathered, both of the white and black residents of Wilkes-Barre. And I think for a lot of people in the area, those circumstances, because that wasn't the first time that there had been violence and resistance to things like that in the area. I think it's that violence that really kind of solidified for people that this was, an issue. And it was an issue that people were going to start taking staunch stances against. So yeah, that act, I think, is what really kind of spurred on people in the area to say, yeah, this is something that we need to do something about.
Yeah, I'm so glad you told that story, because I think, working in Civil War history and thinking a lot about Civil War history, and we talk a lot about the Civil War and what it's about.
Right.
And there's such a, still there you'll get lots of people when you bring up the Civil War is about slavery, that people will immediately be like, no, it's not,
Right.
for any number of reasons. And one of those reasons that's often cited is that, what sets a soldier, a young man from the North, a young white man from the North, when the war breaks out in 1861, what does he know about slavery? And the Fugitive Slave Act is one of those things where it's like, he's living with the
Yeah.
consequences in many of these communities all across the North, as isolated and as similar like Waverly. This is having impact in those communities. This is a part of the conversation nationally and at a local level. And I think that for the general public today, and that's why I love having this conversation, because we're bringing that forward to say that this is happening in these communities. Here,
Hmm.
we hyper localize this down to one small community and its surrounding area, and look how the Fugitive Slave Act is having a direct impact on these people's lives. And that's why I'm super psyched that you brought that up, because it's like, this is very, very relevant to people in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and that's the one thing, even with, because we get groups from all over. I guess at this point I can say all over the country, but we do, the local communities really. Obviously, that's not who our program is specifically geared towards. But when we have local residents come who have no idea about this story and how it ties into the big national picture of things, it's really fascinating to see the reactions, because I think when it comes to especially the specific issue of slavery, I think local, people who are into our local history know that we had a lot of soldiers who fought in the Civil War and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the big national issues, I don't think a lot of people in our area realize how important northeastern Pennsylvania was to the national story. And that, like I said, some of these circumstances of slave catchers coming to the area, of even just abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates holding meetings, they get national attention. And like I said, you have politicians who play a big role in this. I mentioned Judge William Jessup, like I said, helped draft the 1860 Republican Party platform. I mentioned David Wilmot before, famous, Wilmot Proviso: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist out west, from the territory we get from Mexico. And these are all like just local people. And I think when we tell these stories, it shows how these local communities that I think people often feel are removed from the big national issues, slavery in particular. I think people, when you think of northeastern Pennsylvania, it's up in that tucked up, corner of the Commonwealth, and it really had nothing to do with that issue, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. And I think that's a really fascinating thing to bring home for people.
So what we talk a lot on the Public History podcast about public history and about working with the public and sharing these stories and those interactions. So I'm curious about, I've talked about this with Cody Aish and his experience at the Seminary Ridge Museum, about his interactions with visitors. So I'm curious about your interactions over the years as you've been working there and giving tours and programs. How has that local response evolved over time as you've been telling these stories more and bringing them to the forefront?
It's like I said, it's so intriguing, because it's hard to say. I don't want to say unknown, because there have been people who have done, like I said, I mentioned some of the books that have been written, some of the other work that's been done to highlight this history.
Yeah.
Waverly, the immediate area that's called the Waverly Historic District, was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2004. So, the history has been highlighted before and talked about, but I think because we're one of the few public-facing ways, I think it's intriguing because most people have no idea. So when we tell these stories, the reaction is, oh my God, I grew up around here. I went to school around here. And then, we had no idea about this. And that's the most common reaction I get is that we had no clue. But yeah, that's the real intriguing thing is just the surprise, I guess you can say. And then kind of watching people try to like process it as we're kind of going around and highlighting these stories, because you can really see a lot of things start to click with people. And, you get into the history, talk about the local residents and things like that, and things kind of start to make sense. But yeah, the surprise is what really gets me, because that's still something that we experience to this day, even though our program has been around for a few years now.
So what's next for Destination Freedom? What's next for you working there at the site?
Yeah, so I'm actually I just moved into a full-time role here at the Waverly Community House. Like I said, I taught social studies in Scranton for over a decade. Because of, people's curiosity in our program, we saw, merit in trying to really push it and bring it to the public in, more meaningful ways. So I was able to come on full time. So that's been, still something that I'm getting used to in my new role here and my new career. I'm working not just in public history, but also in development. So kind of helping keep the comm running. That's been a really interesting part of the job to get to learn about. But we've like I said, we've kind of had a lot of growth over time. Like I said, we started as that self-guided walking tour. We started offering the guided tours. We now do like lectures and things like that. I'm sitting in the Destination Freedom Special Exhibitions Gallery, which is kind of like a small museum type room that we have with different documents and artifacts related to 19th century history. In March of 2022, we were added to the Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program, which was a huge honor for us. And then what we're looking into now is actually we're in talks with some local organizations about expanding Destination Freedom to not just cover Waverly, because right now, even though we do talk about some of these other towns that relate to the Underground Railroad story in the area, we don't actually actively offer walking tours or, programs and things like that in these other towns. So right now we're working with, like I said, some local organizations, local universities actually, to try to officially roll in Wilkes-Barre, Montrose, and kind of like the surrounding area in Susquehanna County, and then Towanda in Bradford County. We're looking to officially roll those into our program to potentially offer basically what is our program, but then also doing it in all these different towns. That's a really exciting, like I said, some of the organizations that we are working with right now are really excited about this potential expansion, just because it's a fascinating story, but it also connects a lot of these different communities in our area that kind of, I think, tend to see themselves kind of removed from each other. So we're really excited to see how that plays out. That's still in its very, very early stages, but the ball has been rolling, and we're really looking forward to hopefully being able to kind of start to announce things officially soon.
Excellent. And for those that are listening and hearing about Waverly and Destination Freedom for the first time, where can they go for more information, and how can they come and experience what you've been talking about?
Yeah, so right now we have the Waverly Community House's main website is www.waverlycom.org. And from there, you can, there's links to Destination Freedom. Right now, Destination Freedom does have its own website, www.waverlywalkingtours.com. You can learn more about our program that way. We also have an app that you can download, which was, again, that's one of the newer kind of aspects of our program. Yeah, it's just called the Destination Freedom app. You can get it on most app downloading services. But if we really do our tours by appointment, so all you have to do is give us a call. All of our contact information is on our website. My email is also on our website, so people can reach out directly to me to set up a tour. Or invite me. That's the other thing that we're really proud to do, and something that's been really picking up lately is organizations, schools will actually ask me to go and give presentations if they can't bring groups up to take a walking tour. And we go to different places, and I do lectures and programs related to the Underground Railroad locally. So there's a lot of different ways that you can connect and get involved. And again, the main way is to check out our website and also follow the Waverly Community House's Facebook page. We post quite a bit about all of our events and programs on there. So that's another way to really help stay connected.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there for now for this conversation, though. I think we're probably going to have you as a recurring guest just to talk about this evolution, as well as some of the other projects that we've worked on together, including some of the great writing you've done for PennCivilWar.com as well, talking more about the Civil War era, the Civil War time period, specifically 1861 to 1865, in this region of Pennsylvania as well. So, but EJ, I want to thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Yeah, Jake, thanks so much for having me. I will, yeah, anytime you want me back, you just let me know and I'll be here.
All right, we'll talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with E.J. Murphy, public historian with the Destination Freedom Project in Waverly, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for listening to the Public History Podcast. Justin, Molly, and I have really been enjoying producing these episodes and sharing them with all of you. And it means a lot that you're here and supporting the show. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave a review. It helps more people find us and lets us know what you're enjoying or what you'd like to hear more about. We've got more great stories and conversations coming soon. I'm Jake Wynn, and this has been the Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you again soon.